The signal radio plant in Stavropol, in southern Russia, sits roughly 500 kilometers from the nearest front line, and for years that distance felt like safety. The facility manufactures some of the most advanced electronic protection systems in Russia's arsenal, systems engineered specifically to make Russian aircraft invisible to incoming missiles, systems built to jam, confuse, and defeat exactly the kind of weapons Ukraine has spent 4 years developing and deploying. On the night of July 26, 2026, Ukrainian drones located that building without any difficulty whatsoever. Sit with that for a moment, because the geometry of it matters. The facility that produces Russia's electronic warfare self-protection suites was struck by the precise category of threat those suites exist to defeat. The jammers couldn't jam the thing coming for the jammers. If you submitted this as a screenplay, an editor would send it back and tell you the irony was too heavy-handed. But this is the signal radio plant in Stavropol, and what happened there reveals something important about where this conflict is genuinely heading, and why a $200,000 drone is beginning to outweigh systems that cost many times as much. Start with the problem Russia now faces, because it runs deeper than one damaged building. Russia's Air Force has spent years treating electronic warfare as a core operational concept, and the logic holds on paper. Protect your aircraft from incoming missiles by blinding or confusing the guidance systems chasing them, and you reduce losses, keep pilots in the fight longer, and maintain pressure over contested territory. The Khibiny 10M active jamming system, also designated the SAP-518SM pod in its current production configuration, fits onto the Su-30SM and the Su-34 fullback among other frontline aircraft, and it does exactly this. It's a pod mounted on the aircraft that detects incoming radar-guided threats and responds with concentrated electronic noise designed to break the missile's lock. By any reasonable assessment, it represents serious and capable engineering. The system was developed by KNRT, the Kaluga Research Radio Engineering Institute, which handles the design and integration work. Signal's role is manufacturing. It produces the pods that KNRT specifies, and that distinction matters when you're thinking about what a strike on Stavropol actually interrupts. Signal, operating out of Stavropol, produces those pods. The plant also manufactures the Smalta, the Gardenia, and the Topol-E systems, covering both airborne and ground-based electronic warfare applications across Russia's military, including components within the Krasuka ground-based electronic warfare system family that also sits inside the KRET production cluster. The facility operates inside Rostec's KRET cluster, which stands for Concern Radio Electronic Technologies, a name that describes its function with refreshing accuracy, and Signal ranks among the most important production nodes in the entire North Caucasus region. When Ukraine's security service directed drones into that facility overnight on July 26th, they weren't targeting a generic defense plant. They were hitting a specific node in a specific supply chain, one Russia needs functioning if it wants to keep protecting its aircraft from the long-range precision strikes Ukraine has spent years perfecting. And here's the thing, it actually gets worse for Russian planners. The strikes were precise enough to target 2 separate production workshops inside the same compound. One warhead hit the building housing expensive CNC machinery, the imported computer-controlled equipment Russia needs to manufacture the complex components these systems require. The second hit the electronic devices workshop on the other side of the facility. These weren't random explosions scattered across a site, and someone clearly knew the internal layout of that plant before those drones ever left the ground. The aircraft responsible was the An-196, known as the Liutyi, a Ukrainian-made fixed-wing, one-way attack drone developed by Ukroboronprom in collaboration with the Antonov Design Bureau. Wingspan of 6.7 meters, weight between 250 and 300 kilograms, warhead capacity of 50 to 75 kilograms, and a guidance system combining artificial intelligence with satellite navigation and inertial navigation as backup. Declared operational range as of early 2026 reaches up to 2,000 kilometers. These strikes were executed under Ukraine's UN Manned Systems Forces, the command structure created in 2024 specifically to coordinate and scale exactly this kind of deep strike drone campaign. Unit cost is approximately $200,000. For that price, Ukraine can send a precision-guided aircraft on a one-way mission to a target 500 kilometers inside Russian territory, and it will locate 2 specific workshops inside a sanctioned defense plant and deliver warheads into both of them. That is not a crude or desperate weapon. That is an inexpensive weapon, doing something extraordinarily precise, and the cost comparison to what it destroys is worth dwelling on. Understanding why the signal plant matters so much, and why Ukraine has been systematically targeting facilities exactly like it, requires going back to where the Liutyi actually came from. Ukraine's long-range drone program did not arrive fully formed. Early domestically produced variants were slower, less accurate, and limited in range, generating headlines when they occasionally reached Russian territory, but failing to convince anyone they represented a genuine strategic instrument. The Russian military's initial response was largely dismissive, and not without reason. A drone that might strike somewhere in the vicinity of a target was a nuisance, not a campaign. The Liutyi changed that assessment permanently. In February 2026, a Liutyi struck the Lukoil oil refinery in Ukhta, located in the Komi Republic, roughly 1,700 kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory. That mission demonstrated more than range. It proved Ukraine had solved the navigation and guidance problems that constrained earlier systems, that it could identify a specific industrial facility deep inside Russia and deliver a warhead into it with enough accuracy to cause real damage. After Ukhta, no Russian defense plant could treat distance as a reliable shield. The signal plant sits 500 kilometers from the front, which in the new geography of this conflict is practically a local commute. Here is the uncomfortable arithmetic that now sits on the desks of Russian defense planners. Signal needs to keep producing electronic warfare pods. Those pods need to protect aircraft. Those aircraft need to maintain pressure along the front line. But the facility producing the pods now operates within comfortable range of Ukrainian drones specifically engineered to penetrate defended airspace, and the pods themselves cannot protect the building where they are assembled because buildings do not have aircraft attached to them. Russia's Ministry of Defense stated on July 26th that its forces intercepted 54 Ukrainian drones overnight across 8 different Russian regions. What the ministry omitted from that statement was any mention of an interception over Stavropol Krai, where the signal plant sits. That omission is either a serious gap in air defense coverage or a carefully managed gap in the press release. Possibly both, and neither possibility reflects well on the program those pods are supposed to support. Reframe the stakes now, because this is where the Liutyi's role shifts from tactical nuisance to genuine strategic instrument. Ukraine's military command reported that deep strike operations during the first 6 months of 2026 hit 697 targets inside Russian territory, generating what Ukraine estimates as at least $6.01 billion in direct and indirect economic losses. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces separately reported that the volume of deep strike missions in 2026 increased by 150% compared to the previous year. Both figures originate from Ukrainian official sources and carry the caveats that always apply to wartime self-reporting, but even if the real numbers sit at a fraction of what is claimed, the direction of travel is not ambiguous. Ukraine is not trying to win by holding a static line and waiting for Russian resolve to collapse. The strategy involves reaching inside Russia's production capacity and degrading the physical inputs that sustain Russian military operations over time. Signal is not an opportunistic target, it is a deliberate node in a deliberate campaign chosen because of what it produces and what that production enables. The plant has sat on Western sanctions lists since 2022, with the European Union, the United States, Japan, and Ukraine all applying restrictions. The intended effect was to cut Signal off from the components it requires to manufacture sophisticated electronics. The actual effect turned out to be more complicated. As late as the end of 2021, Signal was posting procurement requests for components from Western manufacturers, including Analog Devices, Xilinx, Texas Instruments, ST Microelectronics, and Infineon, with some of those parts subject to United States export controls. After the full sanctions architecture came into force in 2022, Signal reportedly shifted to sourcing alternatives through bypass channels and Chinese-made substitutes, with procurement routed in part through Radio Pribersnab, a KRET subsidiary that has featured prominently in sanctions evasion investigations as a key purchasing intermediary for the wider Rostec electronics cluster. This resilience problem is exactly what makes physical strikes more compelling than trade restrictions working alone. Sanction a company and it finds another supplier. Sanction the alternative supplier and a third route opens up. Supply chain attrition through export controls operates on a slow timeline, and Russia has spent 4 years adapting its sourcing networks. A drone delivering a warhead into the CNC machine hall operates on a very different timeline, and you cannot work around a destroyed precision manufacturing facility in a week by filing new procurement paperwork. Which brings the analysis to what the Liutyi represents within the broader architecture of this conflict, and why the signal strike carries weight beyond the physical damage to one facility. The Khibiny 10M pods that Signal produces protect Russian aircraft operating over Ukraine. Those aircraft support Russian ground operations along the front. Russian ground operations connect directly to the human cost of this conflict at the tactical level. The chain running from Signal's production floor to outcomes on the ground is not an abstraction. It is a sequence of physical dependencies, and Ukraine has identified a way to reach into that sequence at a point 500 kilometers behind the line Russia considered a safe rear area. June 2026 alone saw Ukrainian forces strike 11 Russian oil refineries. The night before the Signal attack, drones hit a chemical plant elsewhere in Stavropol Krai. On the night of the Signal attack itself, Stavropol's governor Vladimir Vladimirov confirmed strikes on industrial facilities in the city, noting carefully that residential buildings and city services remained undamaged and that no casualties had been reported. What Vladimirov did not address was the broader consequence of losing workshops full of precision manufacturing equipment at one of Russia's most operationally relevant electronic warfare production facilities. Satellite imagery published by the Dnipro OSINT project confirmed at least 3 impact sites across the compound, with warheads striking the roofs of both administrative and production buildings, and a separate impact on the facade of the main administrative structure. The roof damage is visible and measurable, but it tells only part of the story. What actually matters for production timelines is whether the equipment inside those workshops survived the blasts, and whether the workforce operating that equipment still considers showing up to a sanctioned defense plant in a city that has now received Ukrainian drone strikes to be a reasonable proposition on a Wednesday morning. That second question rarely features in strategic assessments, but it probably should. Physical damage can be inventoried and costed. The effect on workforce confidence at a facility that has just demonstrated its vulnerability to long-range precision strikes is considerably harder to quantify and considerably harder to repair than a roof. The pattern running through the Signal strike and Ukraine's wider deep strike campaign repeats across every dimension of this conflict, connecting drone technology to industrial capacity to frontline outcomes in ways that don't always show up in the headline reporting. If that kind of analysis is what you're looking for, this channel covers exactly that territory, and the next story in this sequence is already in research. There's a concept in electronic warfare called a clean environment, referring to airspace where a side's jamming systems have successfully suppressed the adversary's sensors and guidance. Russia has spent considerable resources attempting to establish clean environments over contested Ukrainian territory, and Signal's equipment has been central to that effort. The building is now compromised. The workshops took warheads. The CNC machines that were cutting components for the next production run of Khibiny pods are, at minimum, sitting inside a structure with new openings in its roof, and the workforce that operates them now knows the facility can be found from 500 kilometers away on a clear night. The drone that found them cost $200,000, which is a rounding error against the aircraft those pods are supposed to protect. The Liutyi found the jammer, and that sentence is almost too clean for what it actually represents. Sometimes the most consequential developments arrive in exactly that form, simple, direct, and very difficult to answer.